And namaste. Now we're going to talk about Hinduism and equality, specifically about one verse that is always quoted in this regard, namely the Purusa Sukta, the hymn of the cosmic man from the Rig Veda, which supposedly lays the foundation for the caste system. There are essentially two conceptions of equality, namely equality in law and equality of outcome. Let us first start with a general observation that equality is an artifact. You don't find it in nature. It's a human construct. It is not a product of nature but of culture. And so, at first, there was a big progress by creating equality in law. Or, in fact, first of all, by creating law. Law is, as a principle, already a form of equality. Because before that, you had piecemeal judgments. The king would judge the subjects brought before him according to the case. And the judgments in different cases might be completely different. So that already was remedied to some extent by instituting law, by creating a system, by creating a rule. For this crime, you get this much punishment. Though even then, it was still very often not case by case, but class by class. There would be a different punishment for high-class people than for low-class people. There would be a different punishment for men and for women, and so on. But equality in law was generally a form of progress. Compared to that, some people find it more progress to have the second form of equality, namely equality in outcome. But that is a completely modern construct. I don't think it existed before the 19th or the 20th century. And in fact, the pioneering country in this regard is India. You see, India had a system of reservations already since the Government of India Act 1935, still very limited for the scheduled castes. But then it has only gone on increasing. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, the father of the Constitution, still envisaged it as a very temporary measure for only 10 years. Now, of course, it has completely overgrown the Indian institutions. And whether that is a good thing, I leave undecided for now. At any rate, this kind of equality in outcome, this social engineering through reservations, through privileges, according to caste, that we can totally leave out of our considerations for now. Equality in law was limited in the sense that the shatters, the law codes, already accepted a system of law, but different according to your provenance. Like, for instance, a Brahmin would never get the death sentence, no matter what his crime, whereas other castes could, if the crime was serious enough, get the death sentence. But then conversely, a Brahmin could be punished for public drunkenness, because, of course, he was entrusted with the care of the sacred tradition. Now, if he, in a drunk state, would lampoon that tradition, would make fun of the hymns that he had come to know, that would be bad for society, or so they thought in those days. So he was punishable even for that, whereas for a workman, you see, if he was drunk in public, it was of no consequence. So, not entirely senselessly, there was a difference in the application of law according to different classes, but the principle of equality in law was already there, as in most societies. Take, for example, a modern issue of equality of the sexes. That was absolutely not there yet. The sexes had separate rights, separate duties, separate privileges. At the very best, there was mutual respect, but there was no equality, no principle of equality, no aspiration to equality. There was no equal access to the same jobs, to the same privileges. Never. So, again, feminism is a completely modern invention. Partly rendered possible by the equalizing technological progress. Like, for example, a pistol is something that both men and women can wield with more or less the same results. If you give a knife in the hand of a man or of a woman, the results will probably be different, whereas in the case of a pistol, much less so. So they make defense more accessible for women. So in the modern age, you get a tendency towards equality, but that was not there in the Shastras at all. So Hinduism accepts full inequality in this case. Now, the same thing, you cannot defend Hinduism by saying, oh, no, Hinduism was equal, like, for instance, between men and women. You can say, yes, you see, there were male rishis, Vedic seers, but there were also female rishikas. Now, in fact, you see, that wasn't much. There weren't too many. In fact, they were called rishikas, which is a diminutive. Now, in some languages, it just so happens that the female of a word is always diminutive. Like in French, for example, the feminine form of Pierre, the name Pierre, which is Peter, is Pierrette, which is little Mrs. Peter. So that there's always a diminutive in French. So in Sanskrit, this is often also the case. So a female rishi is a rishika, which is a diminutive. And so there aren't too many rishikas in the first place. There are very few of them. And even they are usually not very real rishikas. They only say something as a background for the answer next given by the men in the conversation. Or Yajnavalkya has a female sparring partner in a debate, Gargi. So that's what she was there for. Of course, the fact that she was allowed to participate in the debate speaks for a certain form of, women's emancipation, so to speak, of equality of women as debating partners. Nevertheless, in that particular scene, she is there as a sparring partner to make Yajnavalkya shine more. So, you see, there was not a difference between 100% men and 0% women, but there was still inequality. You see, it could be 60 to 40%, or it could be 95 to 5%, but it was not 50-50. And there was no attempt to reach 50-50. In fact, that is the great difference between more primitive cultures and really classical cultures. Classical cultures usually radicalize the inequality, usually create a situation of everything done by the men, nothing by the women. Whereas a more natural state is that women will have a preponderance in privileges, but not in rights exercised. You see, there men will achieve more, will shine more, will obtain more Nobel Prizes, or whatever is something worth achieving. You see, women will also do so, but far less. That is the more natural condition. Whereas in a classical culture, this natural proportion is radicalized. There it becomes 100% men, 0% women. There all the men must have a career and all the women are excluded from a career. You see, that is the artificial position that has existed in China, that has existed in Muslim culture, that has existed in Europe, and that in the modern age, of course, is going out. Now, that has also existed in Hinduism, but not anciently. In the Vedas, we find a far more natural division. For example, women, like men, would wear the sacred thread, whereas in classical Hinduism, it is the husband who wears two sacred threads, one for him, one for his wife, because women don't wear it. So that's not the Vedic situation, and today you get reform movements who restore the Vedic situation and who give the sacred thread to girls also. But so there was less inequality than in the Middle Ages, but there was always inequality. It is silly, just perfectly silly, of some or many Hindus even, who try to argue, yes, there was also feminism in the ancient days, yes, there was also equality. No, there was no equality. Inequality was perhaps not always that harsh. It was moderated by a number of factors, but it was very much there. And so it is just not useful to try to deny that. It is far better and far more truthful to emphasize that the same situation obtained in other cultures as well. Women in the Bible or in the Quran were not equal either. Not at all. So that could be emphasized when the missionaries go and attack Hinduism as misogynist, as anti-woman and so on. It is very easy to point to similar passages in the Bible or in Christian history. Or similarly, when the missionaries point to caste present in Hinduism, it is no use to deny that caste has existed, but it is very apt in this case to point out that slavery very much existed in the Bible, that slavery was taken as a matter of course by Jesus, that slavery was sanctioned, was accepted, was decreed by St. Paul, that many Christians have practiced slavery until the 19th century. In the 20th century even there was the apartheid system, which was also very much based on the Bible and supported by Christians, by Christian churches. So that can be pointed out, you see. Whenever inequality is pointed out in Hinduism, it is usually not very wise to try to deny that. Usually it is there, or there is at least something of it, but it is more useful to point out that other cultures have precisely the same problem. So equality is a very modern idea. To find it in Sanatana Dharma goes against the concept of Sanatana, of eternal. You see, if it is eternal, it means it's not egalitarian, because egalitarian is a very modern and new thing. Now, some people say that caste is the soul of Hinduism. That was a saying by Dr. Ambedkar. Many others have said it, perhaps before, certainly after. Now, in reality, caste has a history. First, it was not there in Hinduism, then it was there. Now it is less there, and maybe it'll go out completely. In the family books of the Rig Veda, the oldest layer, book 2 to 7, there is no caste at all. So the reform movement, Arya Samaj, that wanted to go back to the Vedas, had a point when they said no caste. The Vedas are without caste. Proper Hindus who follow the Vedas do away with caste. There was an inkling of society's layeredness in the 10th book, the youngest book, centuries younger than the 9 others. And that only in one hymn, hymn 10.90, which is the Purusa Sukta, the hymn of the cosmic man. And so we're going to study that a bit more closely. But first, to sketch the history of caste, we will now see the ideology of caste explained in the Purusa Sukta. But so at that point, there was not much of caste yet. Later, we see a development of patrilineal caste, that is to say, you have the same caste as your father, but that of your mother is of no importance. Then later, you get the full caste system as we have known it, which is endogamy. Father and mother have to belong to the same caste. You have to marry someone from the same caste. Then in the modern age, you see a breakdown. On the one hand, because it is wanted, that is the case with the Arya Samaj, that really purposely demolished caste, or it went out of use in specific conditions, like indentured laborers in Suriname, or in Trinidad and Tobago, or in Guyana. They just lost the sense of caste. And they remained Hindus. In fact, in very adverse circumstances, they kept Hinduism alive. So this proves that Hinduism can exist without caste. Caste is not the essence of Hinduism. That much we already know. Even before discussing much, we already know that Hinduism has gone through a phase of casteism, but nevertheless, caste is not the essence of Hinduism. So the Vedic situation, I will explain it with a comparison. The Arya Samaj used to also celebrate the gods without reference to icons. They didn't have statues of Shiva and so on. In fact, they had contempt for statues. And they justified this referring to the fact that there was no worship of murtis in the Vedas. Now, that is correct. There were no icons yet, and so icons were not worshipped. But that doesn't mean they were against icons. They just had no icons. They thought of something else. And so they were aniconic, that is without icons. They were not iconoclastic. They had nothing against icons. And so that is a point where the Arya Samaj has gone wrong, where they put way too much store by this theme of aniconism, where they try to imitate the Protestants and the Muslims by saying, we too, we are iconoclasts, we too, we are against idols. That is beside the point. That certainly is not based on the Vedas. They just had no use for icons. They had no position on them. Now, entirely similarly, the Vedas do not talk about caste, not because they are up in arms against caste, simply because they didn't know caste. They didn't care about caste. And here I'd like to quote the Marxist analysis. You see, Marxists are sometimes wrong, and indeed I dare say they very often are, but they're sometimes also right. You know, nowadays there is a lot of moralism regarding caste. It is like the spiteful, evil Brahmins imposed the caste system on everyone because they wanted to exploit and oppress and so on. Well, that is certainly not how it has gone. You see, that is, for instance, denied by Dr. Ambedkar himself, who said, well, you see, I dare say that the Brahmins were guilty of many things, but to create and to impose caste, that was simply beyond their mettle. It is not true that they have imposed this. And so, against this moralism with which caste is nowadays approached, it is very good sometimes to get the Marxist analysis, which is far more factual, far more unsentimental, more unmoralistic. Like you see, if a particular society, let's say in the Middle Ages, is not egalitarian, they will not raise a fuss about it, they will say, well, the socio-economic conditions for equality did not exist yet. First, we had to go through a phase of capitalism, industrial revolution, then socialism, and then we can get equality. That is the Marxist position. Now, in the case of medieval society in India, they will probably also accept that the conditions for full equality were not there yet. However, the Vedic age is a different thing. You see, that was not yet a complex, layered society. There was a far more primitive society of cattle raisers. And so Shirin Ratnagar, who is a Marxist historian, has said, well, in that cattle raising society, the objective socio-economic conditions for caste did not obtain. So there was no ground for caste, and so there was no caste. And I can live with that. I think it's a good analysis. Nevertheless, in that Vedic society, there appeared the Purusa Sukta. Now, very recently, I read a Hindu claim that the Purusa Sukta is an interpolation. You see, that's the defensive, apologetic mode where they interiorize the criticism by the enemy, by the missionaries principally, that casteism is there in the Purusa Sukta and that is awfully bad. And so these Hindus start saying, oh yeah, but we have nothing to do with it. And then they start looking around, how can I say that? You see, nothing to do with it. It's in the Vedas. Ah, yeah, but it's not really in the Vedas. It's an interpolation. Now, in this case, it so happens that the interpolation has a certain ground beneath its feet. The Orientalists H.D. Colebrook and no less a person than Friedrich Max Müller speculated that indeed it might be an interpolation, because they thought it was in spirit too modern. It didn't fit with the rest of the Vedas. Now, I think that's a very weak argument. You see, they say it doesn't fit with the Vedas, but then when they find a hymn in the Vedas that says these things, and that in fact disproves their own original position, then they say, oh yeah, but this is not really in the Vedas. Similar thing is the Mrityunjaya mantra that talks about letting go. You know, like a cucumber falling from a tree. You see, you have to let the worldly attachments fall away. Yeah, you have to renounce the world. Okay, so Western scholars have said, yeah, but that's not Vedic. The idea of renunciation that comes only with the Upanishads, with Buddha and so on, it's not there yet in the Vedas. Now, they come across this verse, the Mrityunjaya mantra, that proves that, yes, it is present in the Vedas. So what do they say? They say, ah, yeah, but that's not really Vedic. That's an interpolation. Well, no, I don't think so. And you see, interpolations do play a role in Vedic literary tradition. In the Ramayana, for example, you have a whole chapter interpolated much later. But in the case of the Vedas, people were very careful. You see, this was learned by heart, and there were a number of rules to remember every single syllable. And that was not to be trifled with. You could not just add some hymn. There is a passage in, I think, the Aitareya Brahmana that lists a few interpolated verses. But so it is careful to let everyone know, you see, this is interpolated, most is not. So now just to start theorizing and this hymn and that hymn and so on, everything that we think is not Vedic has been interpolated. That is very arbitrary. And so I don't think this is correct. However, Dr. Ambedkar quoted Colebrook and Max Müller about this. And today, in the spirit of the times, it is very hard to go against Ambedkar. And so now many people do indeed say, this verse is only an interpolation. Well, I will treat it as a Vedic verse. And so does Hindu tradition. Many other writings have reproduced this hymn. like the Atharva Veda, the Mahabharata, the Srimad Bhagavatam. So there is a lot of Vedic support for this hymn. So to disown it just won't wash. Even if it is an interpolation, Hindu tradition has very much owned it up, has very much interiorized it and made it a part of all its other writings, and has certainly put it into practice. It has used this Vedic verse very often as a justification of the caste system. And there is a very bizarre fact about this presence of caste in the Purusa Sukta that we will see shortly. But let us first mention another escape route, a way of trying to say, oh yeah, but we are not responsible for the Purusa Sukta. It is another apologetic attempt, namely to say that it was not really Vedic, it was borrowed from the Iranians. In the Koenraad, which is a late scripture in the Avesta, in the Iranian tradition, there is mention of 4 pistras. Pistra means color. So in society you have 4 colors. Now this is exactly what the Purusa Sukta says. You see there are 4 varnas. What is varna? Varna means color. So you have the exact same imagery. And so you have indeed 4 colors, 4 varieties in society. There are 4 different functions, namely priestly, warrior, entrepreneur, and worker. And so they are summed up in the Koenraad, and they are also summed up in the Purusa Sukta and in many other Hindu writings. So again, it is silly to try to disown it. In the case of the Iranians, it is also obvious. They simply have the same tradition as the Vedic people, or as the Hindu people, of the same origin. In fact, the Iranians come from India, or even if they don't come from India, in the Aryan invasion theory, the Indians and Iranians have stayed together for a long time as Indo-Iranians, somewhere in Afghanistan, before coming into Iran, respectively into India. So at any rate, this is a common tradition of pistras or varnas. It is not at all that this is non-Hindu and that Hindus have for some reason been forced to follow this foreign tradition. That's simply not the case at all. So, even though it was used as a justification for caste, strangely, caste is not mentioned in it. The 4 varnas are mentioned, but then there is nothing casteist being said about them. It simply says that society has 4 different functions. And that is true in any advanced society. No matter how the folk, the people who practice any of these 4 functions are recruited. It is nowhere said that these people have to do their job by birth, by heredity, that they have to do the same thing as their father. Much less is it said that people belonging to one caste have to marry someone from the same caste. There is no caste endogamy. So the typical attributes of caste are not present in the Purusa Sukta at all. There is only a mention of 4 functions in society. And these are there in any society, reason why similar texts exist in other cultures. You see, first in the Purusa Sukta, you have a correspondence between the parts of a human body and the parts of the universe. Like the skull is the heavenly vault, like the feet are the earth, like the bones are the mountains, the eyes are the sun and the moon, the blood corresponds to the rivers, and so on. That is a story that appears in many other mythologies and traditions. Then specifically, this is also applied to the social world. And then it is said that the head corresponds to the priestly function, the arms and the chest correspond to the martial function, the lower body corresponds to the commercial function, the entrepreneurial function, and then the feet correspond to the support function, the workers who keep this whole machinery going. So this is nothing special. For example, if missionaries try to trouble you with this Purusa Sukta, saying what a terrible base for casteism it is, you have to point out to them that the same comparison is made by St. Paul in the New Testament, where he explicitly said that the body parts correspond to the classes of society, that of course these classes are unequal, just like the body parts are unequal, but that nevertheless the whole system gets in trouble if, let's say, the cells that make up the stomach start complaining that they want to be cells making up the brain. And so each of them has a different function, some more honorable than others, but all necessary. And so they shouldn't complain, they should simply be satisfied with the role that they play in the larger whole. And this was part of the social philosophy of the Catholic Church called corporatism. Corporatism means precisely likeness with the body. A society made up in a way comparable to the way the body is made up. In the case of Christianity, this particular metaphor was then also used to keep the slaves in their place. St. Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. St. Paul actually sent a runaway slave back to his master. That's what the letter to Timothy is about. The letter to Timothy is a covering note given to a slave to give to his master to whom he is going back. You see? So that's Christianity. They shouldn't teach lessons about social equality, not at all. But nevertheless, the fact is that Hindus have a general problem of social equality. They should do something about it. But the basis for that social equality is not the Purusa Sukta. The Purusa Sukta simply says there are different functions in society. And so that's not controversial, I think. After the Purusa Sukta, you do get an increasing presence of caste. You see, in the beginning of the Rig Veda, in the family books, it is not there at all. Then, at the fag end of the Rig Veda, it is mentioned once. And it's not really mentioned, but okay, the concepts are clearly already in place. And a few generations later, you get Veda Vyasa, who puts together all the hymns and gives the Vedas their final form. Who is Vyasa? Well, he is the son of a sage, Parashara, who himself is a descendant of the Vedic sage Vasishta. And so you would say, well, by heredity, he's already preordained to become a sage himself. Nevertheless, his mother is a fisher girl. And if you know the story a bit better, she's not really a fisher girl. She has been brought up by a fisher father. Actually, she's a princess. But a princess also is not a Brahmin. It's not a sage. You see, that's also a different caste. It's a high caste, but it's a different caste. And yet, you see, there's a union between the two, and the son that comes from it is effortlessly a sage himself. So Parashara is one of the great sages, and Vyasa too. In fact, Vyasa is the sage par excellence. Guru Purnima is also called Vyasa Purnima. It's supposed to be the feast of Vyasa. In the same period, for instance, you get in the Upanishads the story of Satyakama Javala. As you know, he is brought up, or he is born to a maidservant. And so she has been running around working for different patrons and sleeping with them. And she doesn't know who the father of her child is. And so he wants a teacher, you see. He wants to learn the Vedic wisdom. But he knows that the teacher is first going to interview him. It's a job interview, similar thing, or an entrance interview in a university. And so he's going to ask him, who is your father? So he goes to his mother and asks her, who was my father? And she says, truthfully, I don't know. And so he goes to the teacher and he says, you see, I want to be your pupil, but I cannot tell you who my father is. I've asked my mother and she doesn't know. And then the teacher concludes, well, you see, that's a very embarrassing story for you to just frankly tell me. You know, it seems you are a very truth-loving person. This must be because your father was a Brahmin. And therefore you are a Brahmin too. You have the same gunas, the same properties, the same characteristics. And therefore I will accept you as my pupil. You see, some modern Hindus trying to disown caste as much as possible are saying, oh, this proves that caste is not important. No, not at all. This proves that caste at that time was getting increasingly important, but that he was on the right side of the caste divide. That he came across as truthful, and that this qualified him to be a Brahmin by birth. The teacher thought, well, in that case, if he is so truthful, his father must be of the right caste to be truthful. And that truthfulness is a trait that runs in the family. Nevertheless, even if the father was a Brahmin, the mother definitely was not. So at that stage, you get a patrilineal conception of caste. In the life of the Buddha, you get not a quarrel, but a discussion between the Buddha and his friend Prasenajit, where Prasenajit is very dissatisfied and unhappy because his wife turns out not to be a real Kshatriya, not to be an aristocrat like himself, and that therefore his son will also not be a real Kshatriya. But the Buddha takes the old position. He says, well, caste is patrilineal. Since you are a Kshatriya, your son is a Kshatriya. Buzz. But Prasenajit has a problem with this. Ultimately, okay, he follows the Buddha because it's the Buddha after all. But nevertheless, he clearly goes with the new line, the innovation at that time, which is endogamy. Both parents have to be of the same caste. So you gradually see the caste system hardening. In the beginning, it is not there at all. Then it is there only in theory. Then it is there as a patrilineal institution. Finally, we get the full caste system. And then for some 2,000 years, Hinduism has been bound up with the full caste system. So that you have to recognize as historically the case. Christianity is closely bound up with slavery. Islam is even more closely bound up with slavery. And they have to deal with that. Now, Hinduism may not essentially be linked to caste, but historically, you see, it has been so closely linked to it and for so long that it is really a problem that you have to deal with. It's a responsibility you have to assume. Finally, I'd like to say something about untouchability. Untouchability, of course, is not mentioned at all in the Vedas, not in the Purusa Sukta either. I heard at the annual conference of the American Academy of Religion, which is the most powerful trend-setting body of religious studies, a girl from Andhra Pradesh, a PhD candidate in some American university, and clearly groomed by the Christian missionaries, give a very funny explanation. She said, in the Purusa Sukta, the Panchamas, the fifth caste, the untouchables, are not mentioned. And indeed, they are not mentioned, and it means that there was no such institution at that time in the late Vedic society. But she gave a different explanation. She said, they are not mentioned, and that shows the ultimate contempt for them. So from now on, you can say to everyone, if you don't scold me, if you don't slander me, if you don't hate me, it is not because you don't care about me. No, it is because you hate me so much that you find it beneath contempt to even mention me. So from now on, you can go to court and say, hey, hate crime. He doesn't mention me. And so this is effectively how she is earning a PhD in an prestigious American university by concocting this story, this conspiracy story, that this Purusa Sukta does not mention the Panchamas out of an extra serious hatred or contempt for the Panchamas. Well, we are up in arms against a very powerful slander machine. That is clear. And this girl was a nice girl. She didn't know any better. You see, there is a very strong indoctrination machine at work to turn everything possible against Hinduism. This also. So you don't have to blame the people concerned. You do have to blame that indoctrination machine and go after it and deal with it. Anyway, so untouchability was not there. Nevertheless, untouchability does have an origin, probably not in the Vedic Aryan society. There are writers, there are scholars who trace it to Tamil society, ironically. And so they say, well, ultimately it has to do with the taboo on death. You see, in certain professions, you have to deal all the time with decaying material, with skins from dead animals, for example, to make drums or to make shoes, and or you have to clean up the decomposing matter as a street sweeper, for example, or even as a dhobi, as a washerman. You have to deal with all the physical substances that go into clothes, saliva, sweat, blood, sperm. And so you have to deal with decomposing organic material. So there is a smell of death around you. And it gets even worse in funeral workers who deal with actual corpses. You see, they are constantly in the atmosphere of death. There is a stench of death hanging over them. And so people who care about their purity will avoid them. That's why they have become untouchable. Now, whether tracing that to the Tamils is fair or is correct, I don't know. I mention it as one hypothesis. But I think traces of it are present in most societies, including in Indo-European society. Like, for instance, among the Romans, the flamen dialis, the priest, the head priest, was expected not to be around, to remain absent wherever corpses were handled. He was not to be present at funerals. He had to care for his purity, because on that depended the well-being of society. Whenever he was present to conduct rituals, to solemnize marriages, for example, he had to bring in a positive atmosphere that should not be contaminated with this stench of death. So wherever death was present, he was absent. The same thing counts for the Kohen, the priest in the Jewish tradition, to give a non-Indo-European example. And so this is a fairly universal thing. Even in less dramatic, less extreme situations, for example, butchers, well, they also deal with dead corpses, but not of human beings. In many societies, they were kept at a distance. They were deemed necessary, but nevertheless, they were deemed impure. They were kept outside the village, for example. And so European medieval society had practices like that, like, for instance, against executioners. So here again, the best is for Hindus to just assume responsibility to the extent that their tradition is responsible for this. They should take it upon themselves to do something about it. And they really should. As an outsider, that is one of the things that I find most troublesome in India when I see certain discriminations against people of the lower rungs of society. And so it is best for Hindus to realize that this is what makes Hinduism hated in a large part of the world. You see, people know very little about Hinduism, except that it is a bit colorful and it's just nice music and so on. But the one thing they all learn in school about Hinduism is about the caste system. What they learn is Hinduism is caste, holy caste, and nothing but caste. And so if anything good is being said about Hinduism, very soon you will get a secularist or a missionary or so saying, but what about caste? And then they try to bring discussion back to their familiar line of caste. And so you see, the rest of the world thinks that this is a very big problem, and if anything, they also have to deal with it. You see, why is there such a meddlesomeness of the West in India? Why are there all these NGOs dealing with human rights, for the Dalits and for the tribals and so on? Well, that perhaps has to do with the history of slavery. Post-colonial societies feel that, well, you see, what we did with slavery, that was not good. You see, of course, we gave the world the first man on the moon and all these nice things, but we also practiced slavery. And so that we abolished slavery, that was a good thing, but not good enough yet. So we have to continue the fight against slavery by going to the places where it still exists and doing something about it there. And where does it exist? In India. The caste system, that is another form of slavery, or so the reasoning goes. And so it is not because they want to continue colonialism and slavery that they try to belittle Indians and berate Indians. On the contrary, they themselves feel very morally, as achievers, as morally superior by meddling with caste, because, you see, they feel that this is a continuation of the struggle against slavery. And they don't treat the Hindus as colonial underlings. No, they treat them as slave masters. And so the struggle against slave masters some time ago in the American South, for instance, that continues by fighting against you. You see, very many Westerners feel very good about themselves or aspire to feel very good about themselves by going to India and fighting caste, or, you see, fighting everything that they associate with caste, such as the Hindu movement. Because the reasoning there is, these are Hindu fanatics, Hinduism is caste, therefore Hindu fanatics are fanatically in favor of caste, are the ultimate champions of caste. You see, that may not be very correct, but that is how the world sees it. So those are things that you really have to do something about. This may sound a bit moralistic, but it is really just practical. If you would like to defeat your enemies, if you would like to defeat those who want to destroy Hinduism, then it is best to understand their motives. You see, Hindus may call them enemies, may think up all kinds of conspiracy theories, and they like to think that the whole world has it in for India. No, you see, people are against Hinduism not because they are against Hinduism as such, but because they are against caste that is associated with Hinduism, because they are against inequality. So, one thing is to explain, but you can first best start with understanding what exactly the problem is. So, to sum up very briefly, Hinduism is not caste. Hinduism has existed for thousands of years without caste. till in the very, very highest chronology about 3,500 years ago. Then caste gradually started, and then like by the start of the Christian era, caste was in full bloom, and it has bedeviled Hinduism for about 2,000 years. And so now it is really time to put an end to it. And in a way, you see what I say now is a bit anachronistic. In the time of Mahatma Gandhi, people were already trying to put an end to it. Even earlier in the time of the Arya Samaj, people were doing that. So what am I still talking about it? Yes, but the situation is that Indian politics nowadays has revived caste in a new form with the competition for reservation, keep on privileging my caste against all the others. So caste is still very alive, and it is really time to put an end to it. So I would say take inspiration from the Rig Veda, take inspiration from the Purusa Sukta. It has nothing to do with caste. In fact, even like the Manusmriti and many other writings of Hindus, there are a few things that you might criticize, that the enemy also criticizes, but there is very much that you shouldn't disown that is very good. In the case of the Purusa Sukta, all of it is all right. There is nothing casteist about it. But there are a few lines that are really bright, that are really very inspired. For example, the start of the Purusa Sukta says that the Purusha, the cosmic man, has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet. That means that the whole of humanity is the Purusha. We all together, we are the heads of the Purusha. All our consciousnesses put together are the consciousness of the Purusha. Now, that I find a really bright line. That I find an insight of genius. That is also the Purusa Sukta. And so, I would never, if I were a Hindu, I would never try to disown the Purusa Sukta. I would never say, oh, it was borrowed from the Pistras, the colors in the Avesta. I would never say, oh, it is an interpolation. On the contrary, I would be proud of the Purusa Sukta. And so, whatever you do with caste, and I think you should do something about it, nevertheless, that is no reason to disown the Purusa Sukta. On the contrary, long live the Purusa Sukta. Thank you.